welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have these panelists with me, friends from a long time, and people who have been working on aspects of things very relevant to Ashoka. The session title is Building a Changemaker Culture Purpose Through Curricular Reform to Business Management. So in the current moment, we're facing fallout from a global pandemic, confronting and addressing historical and current inequalities, an economy in radical shift. And we're already seeing changes in education and employment practices as a result. In building back better, we need to ask ourselves what skills and abilities do we need to rethink for this new world ahead. Over the next 75 minutes, we'll have a chance to hear from 3 individuals who lead institutions and who are addressing questions of these skills and abilities which are needed for this new strategic environment. We'll leave at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So as questions are arising in the middle of the panel, feel free to drop these into the chat. So in this world of accelerating change, one of the things we need to ensure we're offering students, employees, is our skills and abilities to thrive in a world of change. Ashoka sees these skills as empathy, teamwork, leadership, and having opportunities to practice change making. We define change making as envisioning a change bringing together people around a goal for the common good. Each of our panelists are working on aspects of this in the organizations that they lead. I'm going to turn to each of the panelists one by one, and as they begin to answer the question, feel free to introduce yourself. I'm going to start with Shiva Kumari, who is president of the International Baccalaureate. And my question for Shiva is that I understand the IB, K through 12, is contemplating changes to its world-renowned program and looking at a review of the diploma. And I wanted to ask you what problem it is that you're trying to solve in doing this.
Great. Thank you, Diana. As you said, I'm the Director General of the International Baccalaureate. And to give people a sense of what that is, we have schools around the world that adopt our curriculum. And we're known for international education. I think it's important to give that context. So I'm real pleased to be here. So thank you for inviting me. I think the big question we were trying to solve, tallies well with the introduction you gave. The world around us is changing, and we have to keep up with the changing world. And we also have to keep up with the changing knowledge of what is emerging as needed in the world of work today. So I think this prompted us then to revisit the programmatic aims of our 50-year-old diploma program, which is called DP. And it's administered around the world, and universities accept it as a well-regarded entrance to their campuses, and they value the students because these students tend to engage in both societal life and in academic life with vigor. I think one of the big things we started to think about is we need to prepare students for the big test that is their life, or their lives, and how do we create change makers for them to become change makers throughout their life? So it's kind of like habitual conditioning of thinking of this way. The particular, I don't know that there were problems. The particular aims we were trying to address is, I think, just 2 fundamental questions. First is, what type of a learner is needed for the world today, given that we're in the 4th industrial revolution? Everyone knows what that means. Machines are talking to each other. They probably can think faster and better than us as humans. So they're solving more problems than we could possibly do in the past. So in this new world, what kind of a learner do we need in this world for that learner to feel good about themselves, be able to learn, be able to function, etc. So what type of a learner? And the second question is then, as you mentioned, we're in a K-12 space. So what kind of learning environments will engender that kind of learner? And that's a very complex question for us to address, because we're talking about vastly diverse learning environments around the world, vastly diverse cultures around the world, and vastly diverse country needs around the world. So I think while they sound simple, they are rather complex questions. To do this, I think it'd be interesting to note that we focused on a few things on how we got there. First, we did a large-scale consultation that included students, teachers, parents, universities, and members of our community. Of course, we also surveyed the literature. Then we focused both on the learning that needs to happen academically, because that's what we're known for, as a highly valued academic credential. But also, these days you alluded to empathy and teamwork and all of that. So what kind of skills and attributes are needed in the functioning human of today, and what does that mean writ large in when you think of curriculum? So we focused on those. And then we really emphasize what does it mean to be a well-rounded, educated human being who contributes to the world wherever they are, and who's really thinking about the world all the time. I think most systems like ours or others or universities know how to evaluate academic learning. So, but what we pride ourselves currently anyway is on assessing how the learner thinks. How does that learner compose their thinking? And how do they make connections across disciplines? And how do they make connections to the real world? So now I think with this review, we're exploring how to get to the newer aspects, how to design curriculum and assessments to evaluate skills and attributes. This is easier said than done. There's a huge recognition that skills and attributes are fundamentally and equally important, as academic knowledge these days. So I think it's going to be an exciting journey for us that we're undertaking. We're trying to we're trying to explore two attributes, curiosity and creativity. And it's an exciting journey that we're starting alongside teachers. We're working with some really good institutions like Oxford University and the Australian Council on Educational Research in this early exploration around, the attributes that I just spoke about, and hopefully they'll get better we'll be able to add more over time. So it's really exciting to be thinking about what is the learner, how do we get them to be that learner, how do we evaluate and give the credential to universities, and what has to happen in the everyday life of that learner as they experience teaching environments.
Thank you. And it's interesting that you're in the process now. I want to turn to Katherine Bergeron, president of Connecticut College. And Katherine and I spoke at a moment when she was beginning the journey of revamping our curriculum shortly after she took on this role. And Katherine, I'd love to turn to you now, 5 years later, to ask you the same question. What in joining Connecticut College, what was it that triggered your interest in revamping the curriculum? And what problem were you trying to solve?
I really loved Siva's remarks, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think that there's going to be a lot of resonance with what Siva said and what I'm about to talk about. I think there are at least two ways to answer the question of why we changed the curriculum at Connecticut College. Why I was attracted to Connecticut College, I think I could say, was that I was being recruited to the college at a moment when I knew the faculty had taken on this very, very big question. And there's a reason why general education curricula never change. And that's because you have to have 160, 200 faculty and sit down and actually agree on it together. A very, very difficult proposition. So this was underway, and it was something that made me realize it was a quality of the college that I wanted to be a part of. And I think there are two ways to answer that question. Oh, the first one has to do with inputs, right? What do we want for our students? The other has to do with outputs, which is really what do we want for the world? And I'm going to start with students. You know, we've always had great students at Connecticut College. The best ones have tended to gravitate toward our centers for interdisciplinary scholarship. We have 4 of them: in international studies, in the environment, in arts and technology, in community action. They've been around since the 1990s, and they have a kind of signature curricular program. The students got even better when they were in those centers. Why? Because in the centers, they developed a better sense of what they were in college for. By working on a meaningful problem with fellow students, by working out a carefully designed course plan that related to that problem, and by working in a variety of contexts, right? From research to jobs to global experiences. And this was integrated across 4 years. It worked. Students in those centers had better overall satisfaction. They had better post-baccalaureate outcomes, right? The trouble was they're selective. Fewer than 20% of the students actually participated in those centers. So the question became for us, is that what we want, right? If we are committed to full participation, which is one of the ideals of our strategic plan at Connecticut College, if we're committed to full participation, that means to an environment where everyone is able to thrive and reach their potential and to contribute to the flourishing of others for the greater good, right? If we're committed to that, can we achieve it if only some people are fully engaged? The answer is obviously no. So the faculty sat down and figured out how to scale it. It really was a matter of equity when you think about it. So what emerged is a new curriculum that we call Connections. It was launched in 2016, so you're right, it's now at a 5-year mark. It's a 4-year integrative program that allows students to turn their academic major into something much greater by combining it with interdisciplinary study, a world language, off-campus learning, guaranteed internships, focused professional development. That's kind of the general description. Students begin with a question, they end with a reflection, and at the center is what we call the Integrative Pathway, which is a set of interdisciplinary courses and experiences on a broad theme that essentially wrap around the major, allowing students to explore their question from multiple perspectives, here and abroad, in and out of the classroom over 4 years. Some of the pathway themes are, there's a pathway in public health, there's one in global capitalism, there's one in peace and conflict, there's one in power and knowledge, there's a pathway in creativity, Siva, there's a pathway in peace and conflict, and there's a pathway in food. All of these have in common that they are broad topics that can only be understood from multiple vantage points. So the pathway becomes this vehicle for an integrative journey. And for a better education for the students, because they experience more purpose, more ownership, more connection to each other and to the world, and ultimately more learning. There's a greater ability to learn how to learn, which I think is going to be the most important skill for the fourth industrial revolution. So that's on the student side. That's the input, which I think leads to the other why, what do we want to do for the world, the output. Which goes straight to our mission. Connecticut College has a beautiful mission. It's to educate students to put the liberal arts into action as citizens of a global society. So why did we change the curriculum? Essentially to be able to realize our mission even better for the 21st century. We want to create engaged citizens and leaders for the next generation. We want to create leaders with a purpose. We want to create leaders with the ability to work collaboratively to solve our most intractable problems, and then to bring about change. And that ability can only happen when higher education shifts the focus from expecting students to simply acquire knowledge or to check off boxes or requirements to actually developing the means for students to connect that knowledge, connect across languages, connect across cultures, connect across ways of thinking and knowing. That's what I think the world needs now, more connection. You know, people often talk about the T-shaped professionals, right? And that may be what we're trying to produce, but I think for us, the operative plane is that horizontal plane. That's the plane where everything connects. That's the expansive dimension that we want to promote. So at Khan, we built a different structure to produce that kind of outcome.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I love the through lines of creativity, interdisciplinarity.
And unleashing curiosity.
And unleashing curiosity. Very nice. And Akhtar, I will turn to you and your multiple hats that you wear as a faculty member in public policy, governance, and at the Business School of Washington. Your history in building what is now Microsoft Philanthropies, and I also learned you're an artist, but you've also just published a book named The Purpose Mindset, and would love to hear from you what drove you to write this book at this moment and how it relates to your work at the Academy at University of Washington.
I blame Shiva and Katherine. I mean, they are the ones that are actually creating young people with purpose.
Mm.
My son went to the IB program and just flourished in it. Katherine is creating a community of interdisciplinary learners. And they're all going to land up in the workforce. And if the workplace is not ready to allow them to not just be a place of work, but become a place where contribute through work to the well-being of society, then we are creating a fractured environment. It's not a healthy company, nor is it a healthy society. So I wrote the book with that premise, that for too long, we focused on growth and growth mindset as a way to school, educate, and motivate ourselves. But I think what we are seeing with what Shiva is doing and what Katherine is doing, and we are seeing this across the world, where it's not just growth that drives people, but it's also purpose. And Diana, change makers, anybody can be a change maker. But change for what? Change for whom? And purpose is what actually grounds change from being reflective on the individual to being contributing to the community and the common good. And I think these two educational environments, one, a major effort which is global, international, and Connecticut College, which is actually looking at an inclusive approach to liberal arts education. So purpose, I think, brings that into the workplace. And my work at Microsoft led me to discover that by just creating a space where employees can get engaged in the community, allowed them to extend and contribute by bringing their whole self rather than just a compartmentalized self. And if they have been educated to bring the whole self and now the workplace is saying compartmentalize them, then you're creating a disconnect. So that's part of the reason I wrote the book. And the work at Microsoft was all about recognizing that individuals are going to spend most of their time in work.
Mm.
But work is not just about work, work is also about exposure to everything else that happens in the world. And if you are able to provide opportunities for individuals to connect through their own desires, through their own purpose, now you're actually becoming, people are becoming much better as individuals, much better as contributors, and much better in society. So what purpose does is that it opens up what is a closed circle of personal growth leads to business growth, leads to personal growth, to personal growth leads to business growth, leads to community growth, leads to personal growth. And that becomes an ascending spiral. And I think that's in some ways the role of education, is to introduce our students into that ascending spiral of knowledge, not a closed spiral of knowledge. But it is also the workplace that should then be able to catch that and create environments in which you can do that. And I think in this environment that we are in this extraordinary times of not being connected, this is even more critical to give everybody the opportunity to ignite their purpose, so that in very small ways we can make large differences.
Thank you, Akhtar.
I love the fact, I just want to interrupt, I just want to love the fact that we all were talking about making connections, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
that there's that is the through line between these three sort of spaces that we're talking about that are very different from each other.
Absolutely. And if we are going to solve the problems of the future, we are going to be needing to make connections that haven't been made before. So completely appropriate. Siva, in terms of the principles that you're employing as you embark on this journey of change and thinking about how to make some new connections at IB, what are some of those principles and or any challenges that have arisen that were unexpected?
I think what we have to figure out is, it's a very broad thing, right? To say, okay, how, because this is not about the individual components. As Katherine said, this is about the programmatic layer. And I think it is quite an accomplishment that, Connecticut has brought all of these faculty together and everyone decided to make this happen. I've worked in a university previously, and so I know what that probably meant. And it's also lovely to hear, Katherine, how well organized it is, so I think for us, when we were laying this process out, we had to think about how wide do we want to go and how deep, right? Because it's a program that's been around for 50 years, people love it. And, thank you, Akhtar, for saying what you did, but that's what I hear from parents and students all the time, that the program has made an impact on life. So nobody wants to touch something that has this kind of, value to it all around the world. So we really had to think through how wide do we want to go and how deep, and we had to make decisions about that. And then, we then had to go through the process of thinking, okay, all of this learning we now have after this wide consultation, both books and professors and students and past students and all of that, is how do we organize these into themes? And that, as you can imagine, in an organization like ours, which has a lot of K-12 practitioners, there's an extraordinary amount of conversation that happens as to, why this and why not that. But I think, if you just develop a tolerance for the process eventually good stuff comes out of it. And I'm typically not a person who's very patient with process, but I actually was quite impressed with myself at how patient I was. And well, it wasn't even patience. I think it was really good to actually think through, what does this mean, and have a space in, my everyday busy life to stop and to think about these kind of things. And then, how do you constantly realign this process with that original idea of thinking of, what type of learner is needed in the world today, and to keep that at the center. The focus has to come back to putting the student at the center of the thinking. And I think for me, what particularly resonated is our discussions and our thinking around how much assessment is too much assessment, right? Mm-hmm. And you can imagine with a program like ours or with other places, especially a program like ours where we independently give a diploma, over the years, there's been an accretion of assessments, So I think to figure out, what are we poking the student for all the time? What are we getting? Are we looking for, what kind of learning objectives are we looking for, and how much do we want to assess them, and when? I think for a program like ours, it's a 2-year program, and all of the assessments happen in 4 days at the end of this. And for me, that's like probably not the way to go in the future. So I think we had to have a lot of conversations around that. And, we connected, like I spent a lot of time at Middlebury with a number of liberal arts colleges. I don't remember, Catherine, if anyone from Connecticut College came, but the universities, they told us resoundingly that we really like what you give us. We know how to trust the diploma. We know what it means. But what we want you to give us is twofold. We want you to tell us what kind of a student this is. How do they engage? Are they curious right from the start? Do they develop curiosity? Are they afraid to take chances? And things like that. So to do that, then they challenged us to think of, how do you design activities in this 2-year program that really, break away and think about, the projects and the things that Katherine talked about, the throughput and that engagement. So very well laid out engagement with real world problems and all of that. Mm-hmm. So to do that, then we had to give up the worry. I mean, not to start from the question of, can we assess these activities? Because it's almost always a stopped conversation, right? Because some activities will be hard to think through. So I think that's another principle we had to keep in mind, is like, let's not start with conversations that already stopped before they start. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing is, I think for aspect for us that we had to think through is, what type of a learner is needed where the information tsunami is on a daily basis, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there was one statistic I read where the student entering a 4-year program, by the time they exit the program, 50% of the knowledge they learned is already outdated. And that would scare the living daylights out of me. So I think, so we had to think through this. These students are having this information flood. How do we center them? How do they discern, how to handle large volumes of information and turn that into knowledge? Mm-hmm. When the validity of sources is unknown, when, and now information is coming from so many sources. So it's not particularly from journals, it's coming from here, it's coming from there. And so how do you deal with this? And it's not just information that's valid, academic and all of that, but also information that's frivolous, that, calls for our attention, the swipe every 7 seconds and everything that we're all programmed to do. So how do you think through all of these things in such an environment? What skills do you need, life skills do you need to teach the student? So they're very aware and reflective of everything they're doing. And how do they remain centered? I think Akhtar's book about purpose is important. I think, that centering in a global world that both Katherine and Akhtar spoke about is very important. So what do you center around? What do you want to retain of yourself, your culture, and not get lost, right? What's the anchor that anchors you in a global world is a very, very important question. And so I think we have to, the other thing we know with the fourth industrial revolution is that students will have to learn, they'll have to unlearn, and they'll have to relearn.
Yeah.
And they'll have to feel good about this process. You know, they have to feel okay with forgetting something and starting somewhere. Or if you were learning in one way, in one discipline, and because disciplines have ways of thinking and knowing as well, how do you switch from that discipline to another kind of discipline, you know, disciplinary thinking? So I think you also what kind of neural networks and agility of mind is needed to think across subjects, because it's a different way of thinking, you know. And then, you know, and also to be able to think in a systems manner, I think, to systematically think in a systems manner is really hard. So I think, how do you kind of train these students to do that? And, you know, how do you train them for a future that will require them to ask more and more questions and more and better questions, almost always without a right answer, you know? So I think that's something else to think about as well. So I think, you know, to kind of like sum it all up, how to create a habitually good thinker who can add value to themselves over time and add value to the world. I think these are all kind of the design questions we had to navigate as we started this process.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And it shows the richness, the depths, and the multiple stakeholders that you have been engaging with along this journey. Mm-hmm. And Katherine, I'd love to hear some more how-tos. How did you engage faculty? What other stakeholders did you need to engage in this conversation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting and maybe different about, you know, an IB program, which is something that is going to be undertaken at so many different places around the world, and thinking about a cultural change within an institution, right, is that there are owners of that institution, and the owners of the curriculum in a college is the faculty, right? So as I alluded before, you actually have to have agreement, sort of full-on consensus about what you're going to do in order to move forward. And so that's the question that everyone asks me all the time is, how did you do it? You know, how is this possible? I think the answer to the question, and it may be related to what Siva was getting at, it's grassroots collaboration is actually what's required, as in any kind of social change movement, right? And I think to make a change of this magnitude, you need two things in an institution like mine. You need the full participation of the faculty, and you need iteration, right? So our faculty organized themselves. In fact, this had started before I arrived, as I mentioned. There was working group on working group on working group. I actually, at the sentence, I perhaps maybe shared Shiva's questioning of process. You know, it seemed to me like, wow, there's a lot of process here. Where are we actually going? And, you know, honestly, my mind changed as I entered into conversation, because I could see that each working group had a different set of people. They were all trying to attack the same problem and different problem at the same time. Each handoff, you know, there was a summer working group and then a fall working group and then a spring working group. Each handoff actually created more clarity. And then we got somewhere. And I think I'll never forget the faculty meeting. The first somewhere was a framework for the 4 years, right? Actually somehow distilling the idea of what you're going to do in 4 years. And there was an amazing faculty meeting. It will be, you know, go down in the annals of higher education, at least in my memory. So the chair of the faculty actually, before he introduced the motion that the whole faculty was going to vote on, that this was going to be the 4-year framework, he asked everyone who had been involved in any one of the groups that had been involved to stand and remain standing while he was listing the groups, going back more than a year. And by the time he was finished, 80% of the faculty was on its feet. Okay, so that, first of all, was an important reminder of how you build something. And the second is that it was an important message to the room that this was not a top-down enterprise. This was something that had been built together. So then after the framework was decided, there were still other groups that were engaged to work out individual pieces of content, and it kept going. And then the final vote on all the different pieces was about 6 months later in May of 2015, which was the end of my first year. Then there was more iteration, right? Because what they voted was to put it in place for the fall of 2016. So in the pilot year, there were things that we tested out. Some of the first year program that they were trying was tested out in that first year. That was one level of iteration. There were changes made when people saw that certain things didn't exactly work the way they thought they were going to work. And then there was more in the following year, which was the year the curriculum started. But of course, each subsequent year had a new frontier. We had these pathways. The pathways start in the sophomore year. So the pathways had to be built. And then once students were entering the pathways, we actually had to think about, was this working the way we wanted it? Fortunately, we did get 2 grants. We got a grant from the Mellon Foundation and a grant from the Endeavor Foundation that was a $1.55 million total, which really actually helped us, in this startup phase. But then, so you worked out each year all the way up to the culminating event. And I didn't mention this before, but the connections culminates in what we call an all college symposium. It's a day when we cancel all classes and the students present in a conference, not unlike this one, talking about the results of their 4-year journey, every single student. The first one was in November of 2019, and that was the first cohort to go through the program. There were 160 participants that day. I can tell you it was an absolutely thrilling day. And the success of that day was more than a validation that this had been the right thing to go. I've never seen faculty so happy. It was also something you realize that rarely happens in our 4-year journeys, this kind of independent mindset that people have, like it's your journey. Well, no, it's actually our journey. And when you have a day set aside that allows people to discover what other people have discovered and to share that knowledge widely, and to have faculty and students and staff, the entire college community visiting and listening in and asking questions, it was really an amazing moment. So what we heard stories, and you take away stories from that day, stories of improving access to dental care in under-resourced neighborhoods outside of Baltimore, or stories of drafting policy on drone warfare at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, or stories of applying dance and movement research to improve the lives of aging citizens, or stories of school system reform. They go on, each one an individual representation of someone's unique journey. We did this symposium again this past fall. Of course, because of COVID, it was online. There were 200 participants in that symposium. It was just as thrilling, even though it was online. Maybe the advantage of it being online is that now some of that content actually lives on the web, so that more people can have access to it. And there's something that I had predicted would come true, and I watched it happening. And that is, just think about this virtuous cycle that happens then when seniors are presenting the results of their 4-year journeys, and the first-year students who are in their first-year seminars have the ability to go to that all-campus symposium in the fall and begin to see their own questions unfold. In the question period, I could see first-year students stand up and say, this is the most fascinating thing, and I think I already know something that I want to do. It's this kind of sharing that makes you realize that your journey is not a solo journey. 70% as a result of the last symposium, now 70% of our sophomores are enrolled in the pathways and centers. And that's obviously a 75% increase over the years gone by of that specialized education. So one of our goals is getting accomplished.
I can imagine the impact on faculty as well, to
Yeah.
see the person they had in their freshman class and what they've become, given that it's a whole community.
I will also tell you that there's just this amazing thing when students start to say, this course was the beginning of my turning. And then there was this course, and we never give them the opportunity to stop and reflect and really retell that kind of narrative. So first of all, I think it's an incredible pleasure to be able to hear after the fact, the kind of impact that an individual course may have had on a student's journey, but also the opportunity for the student to actually retell that for him or herself.
Mm-hmm.
Diane, may I add something?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, Catherine, there's such a lovely event that you created there. And one of the things I was thinking is, but you're also making it really alive to show what a university should be. It's a center of community, which, as you exemplified there, is always lost. But what I was, thinking as you were talking is it's a real life knowledge creation campus, where it is, knowledge always gets created at a campus, but you delegate it to faculty, right? That's the purpose.
Yeah.
Here it is real life and community sharing. I really like the story of the young freshman looking at the senior and thinking, okay, I really know what that is, and getting excited by it, and hopefully they can also, if that research is captured, they can just build on it as well.
It's true. And when you have a student-centered environment, well, it is, you begin to find your purpose, right? If you actually realize that, in fact, you're meant to have a voice, right? You don't have to wait for someone to give it to you, and so that's where peer-to-peer education becomes so important.
Turning back to you, Akhtar, I'd love to hear your reflections on either Microsoft in your role as chief catalyst, and as a professor. How are you bringing out a purpose mindset and reflecting on comments from Katherine or Siva?
So first of all, just so exciting to hear both Siva and Katherine. So it's just fascinating to see how we are remolding young people. And I would actually beg to differ a little bit that we are not in the fourth industrial revolution. I think that's old. I think we are in the purpose economy. We went through the agricultural economy, we went through the industrial economy, we went through the information economy, and now we are in the purpose economy. Because what is being driven by everybody that you all are training is things that are purposeful. So I'll give you two examples as to how Microsoft and what we did to allow for some of that to happen in the company. A young employee, Kevin Wang, who I profile in the book, a son of a Chinese immigrant, grew up in the Bay Area, went to Berkeley High School, studied computer science, and was always interested in teaching others computer science in school. So he was always volunteering. Went to Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, did his computer science, continued to mentor kids in high school, and eventually took his first job teaching in a school in the Bay Area, computer science, because he felt that that's what was important for him to do. He then went to Harvard, got a degree in education, and was going to go down that educator's path when a friend took him for an interview at Microsoft. The recruiter was there on campus at Harvard, and he said, yeah, I need to pay my bills, I need to pay off my loans, I'll go program. So he lands up at Microsoft, but does not forget that that's what he wanted to do. So in Seattle, he goes to his neighborhood high school and says, can I come and teach a class on computer science? But having taught and having got his training at Harvard, knew that he could not just be an interloper. He said, I will partner with a faculty and we will teach together, and I will train the faculty so that they can actually teach much more effectively. Because in 90% of the high schools in this country, there isn't a trained person that actually teaches computer science. Right? So he started volunteering every day and started teaching. A couple of friends heard him, a couple of other schools heard about this kid, and he expanded it to a few schools. And he came knocking on our door and said, hey, give me some money, I want to do this. We kind of said, yeah, but it doesn't really fit in what we want to do. So we kept him happy for a little bit. Till one day, his senior VP heard about what he was doing. And he's kind of looking at us and saying, why are you wasting your time doing this? We should be adopting this program at the company. Of course, I wasn't smart enough to recognize that. And then I get a call from Satya Nadella, who group this Kevin was working for. And Satya basically tells me, Akhtar, what are you doing, man? This guy should be with you. This should be a program that we run as a company. He said, what's your problem? I said, I don't have a headcount and I don't have money. So he said, okay, fine, I'll give you this headcount. I will transfer it to your organization and I'll give you some money. So from there, it's now in 600 schools in this country, mostly underserved communities. 35% of the kids that get taught are from minority communities, Hispanics or Black. 35% are girls. This is more than anything at any program that is doing that are focused on Blacks or girls or Latinos. And the AP graduation rate is much higher than the national average in terms of the score. There are 6,000 individuals that volunteer from Amazon, from Microsoft, from Google, from every tech company, defense company. We work in rural Alaska. We teach in North Dakota, South Dakota, Western, and this is something that he envisioned. And we eventually just became a place for him to flourish. Right? So individuals can make a huge difference. The second story is of Roberto D'Angelo and his wife, Francesca Fideli. They both had, after several attempts of miscarriages, they had a baby boy who had a stroke in birth. And this was devastating for this young couple. Right? And for the first 2 years of the baby's life, they focused on improving the side that was weak or paralyzed, right? I mean, because that's what happens in a stroke. Half his side was paralyzed. Till he met a surgeon, a neurosurgeon in Italy, which is where they live and they work from, Microsoft employees. And the neurosurgeon introduced to them a mirror concept, a concept called mirroring, where the body actually, if you focus on the strength, the body imitates, the weak side starts imitating the strong side. And for the first time, the child saw joy in the parent's eyes. But what got introduced in 2014 is that a hackathon that Satya Nadella introduced rather than a company meeting, he said, we are just going to get people to come and hack solutions. And the philanthropy team created a program called Hack for Good. And he was able to mobilize 30 other employees from around the world that worked with him to hack an app that could allow parents in similar situations with kids with stroke get information or alerted before the onset of epilepsy, because kids suffer epilepsy when they are in this space. And it's very hard for parents. Now this has become a global app, which is helping thousands of other parents. So this couple turned adversity into something that is actually fantastic. Mario is now 10 years old. He's becoming as normal as possible. But here is why purpose becomes so important, and the role institutions play. Connecticut College is doing it because it is introducing a pathway for students. The IB program does that because it values the ability of an individual to take information and turn it into knowledge at their own way. Companies have to do the same thing. It is not just about re-educating the employees on how to write code or how to be a good business manager. It is all about discovering the value each one of us can add through purpose. And I think that's the important lesson from the how, by just these two stories, is create space. The people who run these things don't have the answer. They must trust everybody else who may have the answer and provide them the resources so they can flourish. So that's how I eventually recognized my role in the company was to be a catalyst, which is why I call my practice Catalytic Innovators Group. That it is, that my kids told me this very early on. You're an idiot. Listen to other people. So this notion, and it's true actually, they're much smarter than I am in many cases. So this notion of understanding that we don't know everything, but others can help us. And if we can get that lens opened up, then the discovery lens becomes much stronger.
Fantastic.
I have to say something about something that we all learned this year in our own institutions. And that was a global pandemic actually made it impossible to do anything the way you used to do it. And so exactly what you were just saying, Akhtar, we were all in the position of really not knowing, not having any idea. And it wasn't a matter of upskilling. It wasn't a matter of bringing in specialists to say, okay, this is actually how you become better at this. It was a truly collective effort. And so places that actually function on a model of shared governance, which is often derided for its slowness and its inefficiency, actually had an advantage because we mobilized the students and faculty and staff in multiple large group careers, committees, and worked through almost every single question and problem, and we actually had to do all the things that we're talking about, which is figuring out how to learn about something that you know nothing about, and that the people who are telling you about it still don't know very much about.
But that's what has happened this year, right?
Yeah.
Look at the number of people came together in the first month in March.
Yeah.
Plymouth Hospital Group announced a 1 million mask challenge just to get the community to stitch masks, because we had shortage of masks at that time in this country. In 10 days, 1 million masks were created by groups of people, women, kids, men, coming together and just stitching masks.
Yeah.
the fact that different groups of people came together, it didn't matter at that time whether you were leaning right, left, you were X chromosome, Y chromosome, you were black, brown. People just came together. And when I wrote the concluding chapter of my book, it had become March and May. And I basically start off by saying, if you're reading this book, it is because we came together to survive what is something that cannot be survived unless we focus on the we and not on the me. And I think that's the power, I believe, of what young people have done, is brought all of us together.
Yes. I'm going to turn to members of the audience here because I know some of you are driving change in your institutions. And if you have questions that you'd like to ask any of the panelists, please jump in. You can either take your come on camera to indicate or put a question in the chat. In the meantime, Debbie, thank you for your terrific additions to the chat here, including the comment about accreditation. And in case any of you didn't see it, Debbie, do you want to go live here and tell us? Debbie? No. Okay. Any questions? Anyone?
Hi.
Hi, Joanne.
Hi, I'm Joanne Campagna. I'm from Georgian College in Barrie, Ontario. And thank you for putting in the Audible post there. I think that's helpful. I was just wondering if there was any documentation of the outline of some of the models, I guess, that are being used. I thought it was really interesting that there's one that's over, is it a 4-year program? I know we talked about junior to senior, so 4 years. Wow, that's amazing. Just take away and sort of digest a little bit more. At Georgian College, we have several different courses where we do some of the components. Students certainly present back, and in their capstone project for our degree, they help businesses with a problem, and then they present it back throughout their to their peers. And we did a patio pivoting successful series last summer because, of course, of COVID for the restaurant industry, and we're very much a tourist area. So those sort of things. So we do pieces of what you're talking about, but I think it's interesting that it's an over a program sort of concept. So I just wondered if there was anything line that to make sure I take it away properly. Thank you.
Katherine, go ahead.
I think that, I think that one of the ways you could talk about this is that it's a complete rethinking of what has traditionally for the last 100 years been called general education, right? So that in most higher education, you have, it's been a bifurcated system where you have the major on one side and general education is everything else that is not the major. It kind of privileges the idea of disciplinary knowledge, and the everything else, you know, could work, it could stick, it could stimulate it, you know, it's the idea of being well-rounded. But somehow that general education didn't have much articulation. And it doesn't necessarily, in that traditional model, it's a kind of checklist. In many universities, the way it works out when it's required this way is that there's almost like a hidden second curriculum, because everyone says, well, you just take that course and that satisfies your area 1, you take that course and it satisfies your area 2, and suddenly you have these giant courses that people are taking and without much purpose, without really a sense of what they're doing. Whereas if you think about the multitude of courses, the thousands of courses that are available to students over the course of 4 years, and they actually are given a framework for thinking about how they might choose among them, And there are actually modes of inquiry that the students are supposed to cover in the course of their pathway. But it's almost that everything that you choose ends up counting in some way, and you begin thinking about the reason why you're doing it in the course of choosing, as opposed to getting something out of the way. So it's a complete, I would say it's a reorientation of the four-year experience, where general education actually now has a huge amount of weight. It has the kind of weight that it should have in a liberal arts education. And it gives the major a new kind of flavor and a new kind of presence, because it isn't isolated from all of these other things. It becomes embedded in a larger quest. And then the other reason why general education becomes activated or motivated is that, again, the students in their pathway are asked in that first semester to ask a question, to start to build a question of some personal meaning. And that's not just for one course, but that you carry that now across the sophomore year and the junior year, when you are perhaps doing study abroad, when you're doing community service, when you are when you're in your athletics, when you're doing all kinds of things that you think of as sort of stuff I do on the side. Suddenly all of these things start to become more meaningful when they are when they're motivated by a question.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we think about at Ashoka, also, it's not just ensuring skills and abilities, but that there's an ecosystem. And I think you are helping us understand what that ecosystem looks like at a university college setting, and some of the components of that. Debbie, thanks for yeah.
So I think what's fascinating is when ACSB has been an accrediting body for business schools, and there's 1,700 schools in the world that use that accreditation, and then ACBSB as well added that societal impact component. Yeah. And it's interesting to see what all the universities are like, oh, well, that's like our community engagement stuff, right? Oh, that's like our volunteering, right? Oh, internships count, right? And so I think it's going to be, I feel like we have this stage for change-making education that's available to us, that we need to get in front of everyone to make sure that they're doing it to our level, not to the, the service, fluffy volunteerism thing versus that high level. Let's really think about societal impact and an entire university making that change, not just a little here, a little here, a little there.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yep.
Well, actually, you have to think about what does it take to have impact, right? And that's a really important question,
Absolutely. Other questions from folks in the off camera? Feel free to jump in.
I know Debbie was challenging me to create a material for educators and students. And I actually have, there are a number of people who actually told me that I should do that, which is now going to be my next task of how do I actually make this into something that is a little bit more creative. And one of the ways that we've been thinking about it is creating a board game on purpose. And how do you actually make this as an engagement tool, which is both, a reflective effort, but it's also a collaborative effort. So anybody here that has some interesting ideas and wants to, share that with me or even collaborate, I would love to chat with you all.
Okay. You'll be seeing emails from us now.
But Katherine, this might actually become one of your projects for your students,
Oh, yeah, there you go.
We could work this out,
I mean, I'm just looking at it.
You can come and talk to our entrepreneurship pathway.
Exactly.
I love it.
Do you have examples of some of the questions that students have pursued?
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, I mean, a question on, the impact of drone warfare and how public policy can actually affect it. And this was from a Pakistani student who was very, it's a very personally meaningful question because of what she has, because of her lived experience, and then she actually, did a whole bunch of study and a series of courses and internships and things that actually allowed her to go pretty far in that project. What we have, if you look on our website, you'll see that every pathway has a description of the broad areas that it encompasses. And then there's a list of, here are some questions that might be, but they're really, we don't give people questions. The students' questions emerge. I think one of the things that's really important here, and again, it's about the we as opposed to the me, to your point, that first seminar that's called, there's a nice name for it, the thematic inquiry seminar. Okay, so it's all about inquiry. And I know before we started the thing, people were very nervous, like, well, what if my child doesn't have a question? It's like, I was thinking, mother, every child has questions. What has happened? But the people were nervous as if it was a test to have a question, as opposed to whether it was, that the things that you think of and that you wonder about are actually have value in and of themselves. But think about being in a seminar in your sophomore year, in public health, where there are people from sociology and people from econ, people from math, people from art, people from government. I mean, all of these different separate disciplines, they're declared majors in another field, and they're coming and they're working on their question. And they're doing it collectively. I mean, because you're going to talk about it. And what's your question, Diana? And I say, I'm still working on it. And it becomes this activity that is generative because of the number of different kinds of voices in the room. Yeah, go ahead.
I've used, instead of asking them to give me a question, I actually tell them, tell me a rant.
Tell me a rant. Oh yeah, it's something that you're
rant.
Yeah, what is your rant?
Yeah, they basically roll out. So again, that you've got all these rants out, what is your solution?
Yeah.
Nobody's going to solve it for you. You go solve it. So then people start saying, okay, I'm not just going to complain about homelessness, but I'm actually going to figure out what the solution is.
Yeah, that's, what's also interesting is that, and this is perhaps a very academic problem, but our faculty, they created this, and then some of them started to worry about what they had wrought. I mean, was this going to diminish the importance of the major? And my feeling was the opposite was going to happen, right? Because you don't even know why you choose a major half the time, and you don't often think about the major in relation to anything else. It's its own little path, and as I said, the other things came around it. But what I was hearing students say when they're in that first class, in the pathway class, is that I heard a student say, he's a sophomore, oh, well, I'm a gender and sexuality studies major, and it was a pathway in urban education. And he said, and I feel like I'm bringing my lens of gender and sexuality into these questions about urban education. So it's actually empowering students to be able to see and think about themselves in a disciplinary way while they are also, in a very intersectional context. So
and building on their strengths as a perspective blending component.
You begin to see in conversation with other people how the kinds of things you've been thinking about actually contribute to this broader conversation.
And then, of course, Marina asked the hard question is, how do we measure that the student starts here and ends up here at the end of 4 years to show that they've really gotten to that higher level thinking, change making, attitude change, behavioral change, etc.
That is my question now at Ashoka, is how do we begin to build indicators on the growth and persistence of curiosity, on creativity,
Yeah.
and build that into a sort of index around change making.
I think that, I mean, you have to share that with us when you come up with it, because I mean, in the end, assessment is always a tough thing, and what you tend to assess are the things you can count, and some of but I've always been like a holistic assessment. I've been a fan of holistic assessment, and I do think that when you have a product or a project, when you have something at the end, that itself is something to assess, right? It's actually whether are we saying that it's good or bad, or are we saying that you actually achieved something that you hadn't been able to do 4 years ago?
Well, it is
So
part
I
of
think
our
this,
core definition of change making, to build something new with a team
Yeah.
that didn't exist before for the
I'm
week.
always fascinated with this question of assessment.
Mhm.
Because it seems to me it's a question driven out of fear,
Mm.
right? That if I don't assess, I'm not successful.
Yeah.
Instead, it should actually be why assess?
Yeah.
Certain things will take its own time to flourish. Right? I mean, you don't meditate because you're going to get instant satisfaction. You meditate because it builds a particular value system over life. So there is, yes, I know that there are certain things that has to be assessed. Otherwise, why pay X amount of money to come into college? But not everything needs to get assessed.
Yeah.
There is a journey that you have to let people grow and evolve in their own way. So, I mean, that's how I kind of feel about assessment, which I have to go grade papers now.
You say, and you just write, embrace the journey, man.
Or change the measures so they build value in and of themselves.
Yeah, it's
and don't
also
get
a question of process, how much you value the process and, the outcome. I think it can be done with non-quantitative sorts of assessments, and I think, again, if you're thinking of, if you want students to really enjoy the process, I've been really enjoying the conversation, by the way. So sitting back and participating instead of participating, I'm just listening to it. But I think one of the things we've been able to do is to do this at all levels. So it's really exciting to hear it's being done at the sophomore and also at the employee level. Because Akhtar, I'm sure you know this because you've written a book, that there's real factual return on investment for all of this. I think Deloitte has puts out annually a number of measures that show like $5 invested in mindfulness or mental issues for staff returns, $50 a pound or whatever, So I think for us, that question, I love your thing, Akhtar, about let them rant and then ask them, okay, which one of these rants do you want to solutionize? We do this with students from, the ages of 11 onwards. So we do it at the end of primary school, and we're actually in a project with Ashoka where we're doing it at the middle school. It's amazing how much ownership there is, or to use your book's terms, how much purpose built there is. If you're doing something for yourself, it doesn't feel like you're learning. It doesn't feel like you're being assessed. All of those become secondary because it's so much of what you own. And naturally, it's good because it's your question and you're formulating the answer.
Wonderful. Ken, excuse me, all the way from Japan. Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Here's my comment and the question about this project. So from Asian culture, so it's a idealistic engagement to to the Changemaker campus program, because that program developed inner development programs for the students, and even so, its program probably effective for middle manager in the business field, and so health care sector, or all kind of people during the age 40 and 50. So because they have a lot of serious problem in the personal level and the business level. So I think so it's a wonderful program for me. But at the same time, I'm in Japan, so my culture is the Asian culture. So it's an Asian culture. It's a non-Westernized culture. So how do we expand that non-Western culture issue or the engagement in Westernized culture? So how do you take on new challenge to the Western culture, particularly in the university program? So could you tell me a little bit about that?
And your question is how Western culture will take on.
Yes. So one of the things that one of the particular things is metrics. What the effective. So the metrics shows effectiveness for the program. But I think that so if students are going to be more healthier and more positive
Engaged
in their life, that's a goal of internal inner development program. I think it's a ultimate goal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Healthy, and so healthy from the heart and healthy from the physiological healthy. So that is a goal of a humanistic engagement. So, but at the same time, we are in a Western culture. How we struggle with that Western culture.
But I think this is the big challenge, right? That how are we actually merging these various cultures into a new way of how we educate?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that what IB and Connecticut College has done is to kind of, in a Western setting or a more universally accepted setting, try to bring in both the Western logical paradigm and combine it with aspirational paradigms that get created in the Eastern societies, right? Which is this notion of the combining. Our society has gone so much towards the focus on the me that the we is now what we are all trying to focus on. And I think these programs are all about making that balance between the me and the we.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice.
And some may say left brain and right brain.
Right.
And building the connections between the two. I am being told we are at time. We could be. I could go on for a bit with all of you. Thank you so much for joining, and especially Akhtar, Siva, Katherine, your wisdom and experience. And thanks for your time being here today, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
very much. Bye.
Thank you.
The video, as Marina is pointing out, we'll have a video available in about 2 weeks, publicly available. So thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Incredible.
Bye.